So first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to give this talk. It seems like a rather futuristic talk compared to those talks we've had this morning. These are my disclosures. My institution actually receives reimbursement for my participation in advisory boards for Gilead Sciences and ViiV Healthcare. And I'd also like to make an acknowledgement to all people with HIV who contributed to the wealth of clinical research studies and trials that underpin the evidence we have today for treatment and prevention guidelines. So do we actually need new antiretrovirals in 2023? And I think the answer to that is yes, that we need an improvement in ART. We need lower pill burdens, lower drug burdens. I'm going to talk to you a lot about long-acting injectables today. We're using them in people who are adherent, but really they might be more appropriate for people who have adherence challenges. There are safety challenges with antiretrovirals, and virological failure still occurs due to drug resistance, adverse effects and poor adherence. Now the pipeline that I am going to cover today, the first is long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine. I'm then going to touch on lenacapavir, islatravir, which is back on track now but at lower doses. I do need to let you know that the maturation inhibitor GSK254 is no longer in development as of April of this year, which was a surprise to me when I was trying to find the trials that it was involved with. And I'm also going to talk about broadly neutralising antibodies as treatment for HIV, both intravenous and subcutaneous. Now, these are all the drugs in the different drug classes that are in phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials. Now, I've put a cross through the GSK254 as it's no longer being developed. But you can see that the majority of new agents are in the broadly neutralising antibody class. But all classes, almost, are represented here. And there are different ways that we can actually administer these drugs. So there's long-acting injections with the long-acting cabotegravir rilpivirine. There's long-acting oral drugs where drugs have been modified so that they're slow release and available for longer. There's intravenous administration and potentially wearable infusion pumps, and this is where the broadly neutralising antibodies may be used. A microneedle drug patch, cabotegravir, is being developed as a microneedle patch. Subdermal implants, TAF, is being developed as that, and of course the dapivirine ring for vaginal ring delivery, long-acting. So let's start with the long-acting cabotegravir rilpivirine. Now this has been approved in high-income countries, Canada, the European Union and the USA since 2020. Australia is also a high-income country, but it took till May of 2021 for us to have it approved, but we didn't have access to it for almost another year. So it didn't get a funding mechanism for another 1 year. I believe it's available in Japan since May of 2022. I also know that long-acting cabotegravir for PrEP has been submitted for approval in a number of Asian countries, but the cost is going to be formidable. So there has been a signing of a sub-license deal with 3 Indian generic companies to produce generic versions of long-acting cabotegravir, and that was signed just a few months ago. Now, long-acting cabotegravir rilpivirine has only been investigated as a switch regimen, so people had to have virological suppression prior to switching to cabotegravir and rilpivirine. And you can see all the studies there. The most recent is the SOLAR study, where people suppressed on TAF, FTC and Bictegravir were switched to the long-acting CAB and rilpivirine given every 8 weeks. You can also see that virological suppression was maintained at 86 to 95%, and that suppression was durable up to 5 years, and virological failure was very uncommon at 1 to 2%. These are the results from the Atlas 2M study comparing Q8 weekly dosing with Q4 weekly dosing. And the Q8 weekly dosing was non-inferior, as you can see. And you can also see that the rates of maintenance of suppression were in the high 80%. But there was a small but real increased risk of virological failure in the Q8 week arm compared to the Q4 week arm, despite perfect adherence. There were no delayed injections. Of 11 people in the Q8 arm, almost with virological failure, almost all developed rilpivirine resistance and integrase inhibitor resistance, which will impact following regimens. Injection site reactions were very common, 80%, but they rarely led to study discontinuation. The majority were mild to moderate and resolved in just over a week. Now, what about implementation? Who is suitable to receive long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine? Well, it's almost everybody except for people with chronic hepatitis B, because there is no hepatitis B active agent in this 2-drug regimen. There is currently insufficient safety data for its use in pregnancy. And also we know that resistance to either drug in the regimen or prior treatment failure with an integrase inhibitor or a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor makes that individual not suitable. There was a poster presented at CROI this year that suggested that if you had a detectable viral load in the 1 year prior to switching to long-acting CAB and rilpivirine, then you were likely to have detectable viral load after the switch. And we used to say that people that had difficulty with adherence to clinic visits were not going to be suitable for Q8 weekly administration. But this has been challenged by the SPLASH study done at Ward 86 at San Francisco General Hospital. They introduced a protocol. It was very rigorous. Patients had to turn up bi-weekly for review, but they did have significant support services. There was a caseworker for each patient, social workers to help them with their challenges in life. For inclusion in this study, there had to be no rilpivirine or integrase inhibitor mutations, as I said with the slide before, but they also had to be willing to provide contact information and to be willing to receive outreach visits from nursing staff if they missed a visit or they didn't answer the phone. So there are 133 patients in this study. Almost all were on Medicare, Medicaid, no private insurance. 60% had unstable housing, 10% were homeless, 40% had major mental health illness, and 33% were using stimulants. So a very challenging group of patients. And on entry to this study, almost half were viremic. What were the results at 6 months? Well, 75% had on-time injections. Those that entered the study virologically suppressed remained virologically suppressed. But the most amazing result is of the 57 people with viremia on entry to the study, 97% achieved virological suppression at a median of 33 days of follow-up. It's astounding. The 2 people with virological failure before 24 weeks did have minor NNRTI mutations present at baseline. So these are really impressive results. Caveat. Can this be replicated in our clinics? Couldn't be replicated in my clinic. there's not the same level of intensive resource support. Will virological suppression be maintained longer than 6 months? I think that is also important. Will the results be same in countries that only have Q8 weekly dosing, such as Australia? And I think one of the most important questions that we haven't answered yet is, will long-acting antiretroviral therapy actually improve adherence? We have not seen that yet. What about the predictors of virological failure for those that do switch to long-acting rilpivirine? These have been shown by pooling the studies that were done. A BMI of greater than 30 kilograms per metre means that you need to use longer needles to get the drug into the right part of the body. Any baseline proviral rilpivirine resistance, associated mutations detected by proviral DNA will also predict some failure. An HIV subtype of A1 or A6 with the L74I polymorphism also was associated with increased risk of virological failure. How we actually assess whether someone's going to have low rilpivirine levels at week 8 at baseline, I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but that was also shown to be associated with virological failure, and you needed a combination of two of these for a really increased risk. And there will be an impact on subsequent treatment regimens with that failure. Now, what about the implementation challenges and the feasibility in low and middle income countries? What are the system level barriers? Overburdened clinics, patient workflow, people cycling in and out of care. This is going to be a system level barrier for uptake and implementation of this treatment response. We do need to develop alternative healthcare providers or administrators of the injections if they have to continue to be provided in the clinic. What about the cost? Co-pays for patients. It's important, but also the cost of going to the clinic every 8 weeks, missing work for that day, the cost of transportation. At my hospital, it's the cost of car parking while you're at the clinic that is the major disincentive of coming to the clinic every 8 weeks. We do know that ViiV has signed this agreement for the generic partners to make LA-CAB, but there's no agreement for the long-acting rilpivirine. I believe long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine is currently registered in Japan, Hong Kong and Taiwan, but I was having trouble confirming all of that. We know that there are patient-level barriers. The frequency of injections, when I talk to my patients who come to the clinic once every 6 months, taking one pill once a day, all of a sudden have to come every 8 weeks, is a disincentive to switch. The potential side effects, particularly the injection site reactions and potential drug-drug interactions, can also be a disincentive. For patients in other parts of the world, medical mistrust and the perception of paternalistic control of treatment was listed as a patient-level barrier for this type of treatment. The burden of additional medical visits and out-of-pocket costs and the lack of awareness of the long-acting regimens. We need to avoid using CYP3A4 strong inducers such as rifampicin when using the long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine. You can overcome that drug-drug interaction by giving an oral dose of rilpivirine. You cannot overcome it by giving oral cabotegravir with the long-acting injections. So we do need to avoid these drugs while taking long-acting cab and rilpivirine. It also includes anticonvulsants. Rifabutin is probably okay, but rifampicin is not. systemic glucocorticoids for more than a few weeks, and St John's wort, of course. There are additional formulations under investigation to try to combat some of these problems. There is a long-acting slow-release or nano-formulation prodrug of cabotegravir being developed. There is a more concentrated formulation of LA-CAB so that you can halve the required injection volume, which is important. They've also been adding hyaluronidase to the CAB to allow for a higher injected volume. And we also know that giving the long-acting cabotegravir through the thigh, anterior thigh, gives similar results to giving it in the buttocks. So that also may be a way forward for self-injection. I'm now going to move on to lenacapavir. Lenacapavir is a long-acting capsid protein inhibitor, which acts in actually 3 parts of the HIV replication cycle, but particularly in the capsid assembly. The pharmacocharacteristics of this drug means that it can be given orally daily, can be given orally weekly, but also 6 monthly by subcutaneous injection. It does have a long half-life, and there is a very low potential for drug-drug interactions. These are the studies that support lenacapavir licensing. This Calibrate study was done in naive patients. You can see there are 4 treatment arms. The comparator arm is TAF, FTC and bictegravir compared with lenacapavir orally with FTAF orally, and then there were 2 arms with the subcutaneous lenacapavir in them, both of them after 26 weeks going down to 2 drugs, lenacapavir plus TAF or lenacapavir plus bictegravir. And the results at week 52 are on the right, exactly the same as what you would expect with any naive antiretroviral study, with 85 to 92% rates of virological suppression. There was emergent resistance in 2 people only, and that did emerge in the capsid gene, so that will limit its use. Lenacapavir has been licensed in Australia for the use in highly treatment-experienced people with virological failure and multi-drug resistance. This study was done in a whole 36 patients, and what this study took were people who were failing treatment. They took oral lenacapavir for 14 days of monotherapy, and then they took it as subcutaneous lenacapavir with an optimised background antiretroviral regimen. Unfortunately, with the monotherapy, several patients did develop lenacapavir resistance. But if you look at the results, this was really a single-arm study with a delay by 2 weeks for those that were on the placebo to start with. But it did show 83% of patients achieved a viral load of less than 50 copies with multi-drug resistant virus, which is quite astounding. As I said, Len resistance occurred in about 4 people. Injection site reactions do occur to lenacapavir, but really it was reasonably well tolerated with no adverse events that led to study discontinuation. I've put this slide in because it wasn't apparent to me until recently that you needed to give 2 injections of lenacapavir as a single sort of administration. They're 2 1.5 ml injections subcutaneously, which is a decent burden. What about the implementation challenges in low and middle income countries and, high income countries as well? Again, this drug is recommended to be administered by a healthcare provider, which means a visit to the clinic, but it's only twice yearly injections, unlike the long-acting cabotegravir and rilpivirine. Lenacapavir is also affected by the strong CYP3A4 inducers, rifampicin for TB. And like lenacapavir and long-acting rilpivirine, there is insufficient data for use in pregnancy. At this stage, there is no licensing agreement with generic partners under consideration, and the logistics and the operationalisation of rollout and uptake needs to be sorted. So lenacapavir was originally engaged, maybe, to islatravir. Islatravir is a nucleotide reverse transcriptase, an NRTTI translocation inhibitor. So it also has a very long half-life, and it was proposed that a union between islatravir and lenacapavir could be achieved with just 6 monthly injections. But islatravir was put on an FDA hold. And so lenacapavir is really looking for a new partner in life. Recently, Joe Aron presented data at CROI on the use of lenacapavir with two broadly neutralising antibodies, terapivimab and zerlinivab, and showed that virological suppression could be maintained with this combination. I need to hurry. With a great virological efficacy of 90% at 6 months. This is islatravir, the nucleoside reverse transcriptase translocation inhibitor, active against viruses that have NRTI resistance. Now, in September to December 2021, it was noted that all of the islatravir studies, islatravir at the doses being used were associated with significant reductions in CD4 cell counts of up to 50%. So the majority of studies were put on hold. The studies at the bottom for prophylaxis are not going ahead. But there were 2 studies, switch studies of doravirine and islatravir presented at CROI, 48-week data, switch from bictegravir TAF FTC or switch from oral combination ART. Both of them showed excellent responses with maintenance of virological suppression. So that was with 0.75 milligrams. What is going forward is doravirine with 0.25 milligrams of islatravir, and there's a lenacapavir islatravir study with weekly dosing up to 2 milligrams weekly. So we'll see where that goes. Turning very quickly to broadly neutralising antibodies, I'm going to have to run through this quickly. These can be used for treatment and prevention, but also they've been used in cure studies for treatment-free remission. They target a number of different epitopes on the HIV-1 envelope. The FC domain actually determines how often these drugs can be given and how long the half-life is. If you put two mutations into these BNAbs, you can prolong the PK, as you can see from these graphs. With a single nucleotide, single BNAb, you get a transient reduction in viral load. This is just like antiretrovirals. AZT alone, add DDI, DEC to AZT, you get a slightly prolonged reduction in viral load, but then return to baseline, and the combination of 3 BNAbs is very variable. So a single BNAb can't be used. There are ongoing switch studies with lenacapavir plus BNAbs, but also with long-acting cabotegravir and a BNAb. So This is the summary. The one downside of, well, many downsides of BNABs, but one of them is you need to pre-screen. You need to know that the BNABs are going to actually be active against the current virus. That is technically difficult, time-consuming and costly. So there are potential advantages, but also disadvantages. There are a couple of novel agents for salvage therapy, iberluzumab, which is not available outside the United States, which is a monoclonal antibody infused every 2 weeks, and albuvatide, which is licensed in China, but is also now being evaluated with a BNAB in the US. It's a fusion inhibitor, but it also needs to be given by intravenous infusion. I'm going to very quickly touch on long-acting cabotegravir for prevention. I'm sure you're all aware of the HPTN 083 and 084 studies, which showed remarkable efficacy compared with TDF FTC in both studies, 88% lower risk in cisgender women in Africa, 66% lower risk in MSM and transgender women. However, there were 7 infections in people with on-time injections, and this is where you need to know about the Levi syndrome. Long-acting early viral inhibition. It is rare, but rapid antibody tests and antigen antibody tests may fail to detect HIV, and you need to use a very sensitive HIV RNA assay. So there is delayed detection of HIV, which means that you can develop resistance to the LA-CAB. If that happens, you will need to switch the regimen to a protease inhibitor containing regimen. So in summary, long-acting injectables are licensed in many high-income countries, but clinic implementation is lagging. And that's due to system level and patient level barriers. Formulations and appropriate dosing for children, adolescents, transgender individuals, women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and the obese are totally unknown. We need to ensure equitable access to the new classes and formulations, and registrations of the long-acting injectables are lagging in the low and middle income setting. So thank you.